Thank you. As Kathleen mentioned, my name is Danielle Kilgo. I am a doctoral candidate here at the School of Journalism at the University of Texas. And this project started from an exploration of wanting to figure out why on earth clickbait was such this terrible, horrible thing. And what we found in academic scholarship was that we had to start sort of at a foundational level because clickbait had not been operationalized in academic scholarship. We were barely looking at virality in academic scholarship. So this is sort of this foundational article that we wanted to create so that we could build upon this in future studies. So this conference really has not shied away from talking about online news, so I'm going to not bore you with the specifics, but there's definitely a need for audience engagement with news. There's reformatting that's happened, especially in social media networks. Traditional and digitally native news organizations, which are the two types of organizations that we look at in this viral content of the study, are both required to reformat, especially as social media networks adapt and as the digital landscape evolves. And so within the social media realm, audience interaction numbers have served as a metric that we can use to evaluate success. And those audience interaction numbers come from upvotes and loves and retweets and likes, comments, and shares. So what we decided to look at virality by adding up all the likes, shares, and comments from Facebook. So we're looking at viral Facebook content. And we wanted to answer the question, what makes news viral? So we wanted to look at a few characteristics. And perhaps a bit ironically, what happened was that we start looking at different characteristics, and sensationalism caught our eye. Now, sensationalism is a term that has a really bad rep, and Tiger Woods clearly hates sensationalism as much as most journalists and scholars do. In fact, sensationalism has been derided for being like the sewer of the news industry. I think that's because we're used to seeing sensationalism a little more like this, right? So we're questioning the president's gender, we're becoming zombies because of Ebola, or you're really scared that your children are going to be fed to alligators. And indeed, this is a continuation of the concept of sensationalism as it continued from yellow journalism. But what Grabe and his authors had done in 2001 was separate sensationalism in broadcast news, and said that there's two different forms. There's content, which focuses on this tabloid-like style that we just saw in the previous slide. So sex and crime and really odd things, headless people at barbershops, right? And then there's form, and form is more of the structure. It's the presentation or the style that the news is in. And so for broadcast, one of the examples that he used was like the panning in and out of a really emotional character on a telenovela or a soap opera. So Vinicio and I decided that we would look at online content, and what we decided was that in the textual form, this is more of what we're used to seeing in terms of sensationalism. Oh my God, wait till you see this thing. This, you won't believe what is happening. Here's 8 things that you must know about psychological warfare. And so we broke this down into 4 different kinds of concepts that we want to look at here. Our 4 concepts that we used, the first is personalization. And we use that as a writing that directly addresses the reader, either through an explicit or implicit pronoun use, or through a question, addressing a question to the reader. So you must read this. The second is listicles, which I'm sure you're familiar with. BuzzFeed is in our digitally native sample, and they're like the self-reigned king of the listicle. But I'm here to tell you listicles were here way before BuzzFeed ever was. If you look, for example, at the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, this was like a long-form listicle that was a 2-decade-long bestseller, right? So listicles have been effective strategies for organizing complex information into subcategories that is either seemingly or not seemingly related. Additionally, we have forward referencing, which is really a complex grammatical concept that we borrowed from other research on clickbait. And instead of explaining it, it's a lot easier to just show a few examples. It references forthcoming information without giving the actual object. So this is what happens when your body, or to your body when you're embarrassed. So instead of this fact or this object is what happens, they're just creating mystery by not giving that object. And finally, we look at soft news, which is perhaps the most generalizable sensational form. And while there are indeed complex operationalizations of soft news, we use perhaps the most simplified one, which soft news being anything that's not hard or breaking news. So it really loses the temporal immediacy. So we did a quantitative content analysis of data we got from a subscription of NewsWhip. And NewsWhip is a social media interaction data company that collects over 100,000 news organizations. And we gathered a sample from 2 digitally native news organizations, BuzzFeed and the Huffington Post, and then 5 traditional news organizations, BBC, CNN, Fox, The Guardian, and the New York Times. And we looked at a full year of their articles, of all their articles. And what we did was we added up the numbers of shares, likes, and comments, and we picked the top 597 most viral articles. So we're looking at only the most viral articles in this sample. And it's split about 50-50. So our 5 traditional news organizations made up 291 of our final sample, and then BuzzFeed and Huffington Post made up the other half. And so then we did a content analysis of these sensational forms. And what we found is that sensational form is present in about 70% of viral content. 70% of that is soft news. Additionally, we found that forward referencing is really not that popular here, and that may be because it's associated with clickbait, which is something we can talk about later. But in 2015, in a data study that looked at this forward referencing concept, they're finding that it's more, in the Danish news, it's actually more present in viral content. It's about 17% of the time there. So that really opens up this broad idea that sensationalism may not travel internationally. Additionally, we see personalization and listicle showing up in about a quarter of all of our content. The difference between digitally native and traditional organizations is pretty stark. We see digitally native really conquering sensational form in viral content. We also see that traditional organizations are actually more likely to become viral with soft news, but they aren't likely to use other forms of sensational form. Important to note that this personalization there at the bottom, the 8%, that's almost all attributed to The Guardian, who has used personalization, the use of you, and the question mark in a lot of their content that was well received by audiences. So without further ado, here's our list form conclusion of the 6 things you didn't know, or maybe you do and now you empirically know, right, about viral headline writing. Number 1, traditional organizations are more likely than digital organizations to go viral with hard news. And this may link to the idea of credibility or partisanship, especially since CNN and Fox were a part of our traditional news organizations. And it also lets us know that on Facebook, temporal immediacy does matter, so it does matter that we're still breaking news. Number 2 really seeks to answer the question, what is viral news? And in terms of that, we say ultimately viral news is the production, viral news production is about disseminating news that is relatable and narratively written. And we base that off of our findings that soft news and personalization are among the most used forms in this data. Number 3, and perhaps one of the most important, is that sensationalism is not all doom and gloom. Don't think it's all a bad thing. And I take, for example, listicles in this sample. One of the most interacted with articles was one from The Guardian that gave facts about what was happening in Ferguson, Missouri. And it really broke down the different levels of economic disparity and ticketing policies and the policing in black neighborhoods so that they could talk about really thematic ideas in a list form structure. Number 4 is that digital news is the most successful at sensational forms that we looked at, but they only make up about half of the sample. And this study is based on data from 2014. So it's possible that these sensational forms have now merged and become more commonplace with traditional news organizations. And finally, and this may be one thing that perhaps you did know, and now, of course, you empirically know, is that there's a significant relationship between sensational form, which has both practical and theoretical implications, but ultimately this gives us a key strategy for reaching and engaging more general audiences as news organizations. Our future research continues to look at the role sensational sensationalism plays at an international level. That research is with the Digital Media Research Project here at the School of Journalism at the University of Texas. We invite you to check out our website and all of our awesome scholars that are a part of that group. Thank you.